Welcome, everybody, to the third and final part of the second installment of the Boston University Dialogues in Biological Anthropology. The theme is evolution and altruism. My name is Carel van Schaik from the University of Zürich, and I am going to moderate you to make sure that everything during the question and answer session goes smoothly. So this is your opportunity to ask questions directly. There is a microphone that will go around, and you have to wait for it. And while you're speaking into the microphone, you don't get your regular feedback that you're used to. That's fine. It's just for recording purposes. So everything should be fine. Just speak into it. It's sort of open-ended, depending on how exciting it's going to be to talk about cooperation for more than an hour without getting into a fight. And we will end this session by doing some communal food sharing in the reception in the other room. So basically, the floor is open for questions. If anybody would like to start, has the dares to start. If not, I could blabber on for a bit. We have a question.
I have a question based on today's presentation and the discussion of altruism and in toddlers and chimpanzees. I'm curious to know, a lot of the examples that you gave today involved acts of altruism that didn't really have very much of a cost at all to the actor. And we were discussing as we were watching the webcast, we're curious to know, to what extent might there be evidence, either in toddlers or in chimpanzees or other non-human primates, that individuals are willing to behave altruistically at a larger cost to themselves? And if this is something that's seen only in humans, at what point ontologically does that start to develop in our species? Thank you.
Excellent question. We had a question earlier that was going in the same direction that we didn't get to. So I guess it's largely directed at Felix, but Joan, feel free. Anybody else, feel free to add. But maybe Felix wanted to take a first step.
Sure. So yeah, that's a very important question. So in the studies on instrumental helping, we try to address that by making it costly in the sense of opportunity costs. So we have several studies in which children are engaged in the fun activity, playing a game, or they're in a ball pool thing and have to climb out. We have 18-month-old children who climb over obstacles in order to help the other. So they are willing to put some effort into it and some opportunity costs as well. So it's not that cheap for them to do it, and they're willing to do it. And there are other studies on sharing where they have to actually give up a resource, and that might emerge a little bit later, but it's not totally absent. But it is true that these kinds of behaviors we would expect are less likely to occur than those less costly ones in the instrumental helping case. And I would think that with the chimpanzees, we have that to some extent also, that they will put some effort into it. But I believe, that's a working hypothesis at the moment, that with chimpanzees, it falls apart more quickly when the costs are raised. And this might to some extent explain why there's just not a lot of food sharing going on in the sense of active provision of food, or like virtually none. So where chimpanzees are willing to give up a resource in order to give it to the other. So the positive instances are ones where the chimpanzee herself or himself would not be able to get the resource anyway. So I think when it comes to costs, we probably find a major difference between chimps and humans, including children.
Interesting. Joan?
Although when you think about altruism from an evolutionary context, and you think about the cost in terms of fitness costs, chimpanzees in the field participate in a range of altruistic interactions that go from very low cost to fairly significant potential costs. So things like grooming, which is, no big deal, I think, in any particular act. Not that much time, not that much energy, probably not that much opportunity cost, to participating in agonistic coalitions where there is some risk of being injured, to going out on those territorial patrols where the chimps act as if that's a pretty costly behavior. They're very quiet. They're pretty nervous. A lot of scratching when they're doing it. They look pretty concerned, presumably because there's some risk. And then when they launch these lethal attacks, that looks like it's potentially high cost. So there are examples of some fairly expensive forms of altruism, but they're not terribly common. I mean, chimpanzees don't have the opportunity to, give blood, donate kidneys. I mean, they can't do it. On the other hand, we have the cooperative breeders where we've got individuals who never reproduce. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty costly. So I think it depends on how you think about these things.
Excellent point. Herb.
I'm not sure there's any altruism in chimpanzees. What you calling altruism is what we call normally reciprocal altruism. I groom you, you groom me. In the long run, it's a form of mutualism. Hunting in groups, usually there's a high relatedness among hunters, and also that also might be a form of mutualism. I think it's doubtful whether there's anything we really would call altruism, except kin altruism. That is, I sacrifice on behalf of those who are genealogically close to me, my offspring. Now, in humans, I think it's exactly the opposite. Humans will be really altruistic. And however, even here, I'm an economist, and I have to say that altruistic acts are just things that people like to do. And if the cost is very high, they'll stop doing it. The cheaper it is to be altruistic, the more you're going to get. You expect that. That's being part of being rational. Whatever costs more, you do less of it. Now, there may be some absolutes, but we have not found them yet. For instance, people prefer to be honest. In the laboratory, people will pay, even in an anonymous one-shot game, not to have to lie. They don't like to lie. But if you make the cost too high, then they start to lie. Okay? On the other hand, we have games that people play, like the ultimatum game, where, very simply, I make you an offer of a certain share of an amount of money, and if you accept it, we divide it up. If you reject it, we both get nothing. Now, if you reject a positive amount of money, you're being altruistic. That is, you're paying in order to uphold your notion of fairness. You're hurting me in order to be fair, to punish me for an unfair social act. Now, as far as we know, no matter what the stakes are, people will reject low offers in the ultimatum game. People will reject 30% of 3 months' salary, so much that it's not in your interest to ever make such an offer to someone. Someone will say, people say to me, what if it were $1 million and you offered someone $50,000? Would they take the $50,000? Well, we've never done that experiment. But I will tell you quite clearly, I'll give you very good reasons that if it were me, I would offer half the pie, not anything less than half. Because there are people out there that care more about fairness than they do about money, and they'll remember for the rest of their lives that they upheld honesty at the cost of personal material loss. And if you happen to offer $400,000 and the person rejected it, you'll feel like a jerk for the rest of your life for having been so niggardly about this process. Conclusion. Thank you. Great. Conclusion. People are really honest, and they'll very often pay a lot in order to, really altruistic and often pay a lot. But there's still trade-offs, and if the cost gets too high, people will stop.
Kern?
I just want to add briefly, in interpreting these kinds of experiments, as a theorist, what I'd like to see is not only a manipulation of the cost, but some sort of ability to measure the benefit side as well. It's the benefit to cost ratio that's really going to be critical, at least from our theory, whether you have kin-selected altruism or long-run reciprocity and whatnot. The benefit to cost ratio is the pivotal factor, and what we want to know is, are there threshold values of that ratio above which you get altruism in chimps versus children, or is the ratio somehow, is that threshold different in some systematic way in similar kinds of systems where you have similar ratios?
I mean, just like in the naturalistic studies of animals, figuring out how to measure benefits and costs is exceptionally difficult. And we don't have a lot of access to sorting that out. So, I mean, we could titrate the number of bananas, a chimp's willing to give up, but to translate that into, the theorists' benefits and costs is going to be really hard.
I'm going to abuse my prerogative to make a comment as well. And that is, I think what's really difficult in these kinds of questions is how animals actually assess costs and benefits. If we have trouble, how are the animals going to do it? So what animals probably have, including most humans, I would say, if we don't think about it too long, is some kind of a simple rule. And where we somehow represent costs and benefits, but it's been done for us. So we use some kind of a measurement scale that probably works through emotions and so on, that in the end is going to correlate nicely with cost-benefit ratios, but maybe it doesn't. And in some cases, maybe too complicated to measure that stuff, and we have one fixed response to this. So, as always, simple question can unleash and can dumbfound 5 major experts. So anyway, very good. Let's look at more questions. Anybody? Yes, sir. Wait for the mic, please.
So this is another question mostly directed at Felix, but to everyone else as well. So it seems that in cooperation, at least in primates, a big component of that is kind of cognitive abilities or like social motivations or things like that. But also social structure and context seems to play a large part. And so in a lot of your experiments, you use an adult who is kind of the person who either the chimpanzee or the child is going to be cooperating with, who, adults are generally in kind of caretaker roles. It's often important for the child or chimp to appease them so that they'll get later rewards from adults or whatever. So I'm just wondering if you think it's actually altruism that they're showing, or if it's if these altruistic or cooperative tendencies would be radically shifted in other contexts when it would be another chimp or another child who's the cooperative partner.
I see. Yeah, very good point. I mean, the issue is that what we measure in these kinds of experiments is what they do in a given situation. So what we measure is, do they have a tendency to do something on behalf of the other person's problem in the given situation? So we cannot make any claims about the long-term consequences of this. This is obviously also true for the chimpanzees. So it's very well possible that this is explained by reciprocal altruism, right? So, but you need to have a first step. You have to have someone who is willing to do some tat for a tit, right? And then you can go into tit for tat mode, etc. So that's what we can measure. And with the adults, the issue is, as far as we know, this is reciprocity, for example, is not the mode that characterizes adult-child interaction. So I think even though it's possible, it's rather implausible that this would drive it. So this goes back to Alan Fiske's model about the social relations. But it's still possible that they think that they would be better off helping this more powerful a person over there. So I agree with you that it's very important to also look into peer studies. We have started a little bit with peers, and in these instrumental helping situations, it's not absent, so they are also willing to do that. But there are more and more studies on sharing with anonymous others and so forth. So, for example, Peter Blake and Katie McAuliffe here study these kinds of things, and it seems like there is a trajectory pointing upwards that over ontogeny, and now I'm talking 3 to 7, 8 years of age, there's a steep increase in situations where there is no possibility for this anonymous other to reciprocate and so forth. We don't know yet, I would think, why that is occurring, because this could be explained by to some extent, children having to first of all understand anything about an anonymous situation and being able to imagine that there's this other being that also has needs and so forth. So this is a necessary prerequisite for this. So it's a very good point, and it's true that more and more studies have to address this, manipulating the social constellation, and one way to go is to look at peers.
Excellent. Anybody from the panel who would like to add something to this? It was crystal clear to me. So the next question then, we'll happily take questions. Well, go ahead. Caitlin again.
This might be a little bit farther off topic, but I was struck when you were talking about the cooperative experiments again, thinking about theory of mind. And while it's not necessarily a prerequisite for altruistic behaviors, and obviously it's not a prerequisite for altruistic behaviors, I'm just curious as to what you all might think about the issue of theory of mind and how it might relate to altruism in, again, humans versus non-human species.
Well, that's a great question. I think the psychologist would like to have the first stab, I guess, and that means I'm looking to my left.
Joan.
Oh, right.
No, but seriously, this.
Well, while you guys are thinking,
we probably both have things to say here.
Yeah, but may I suggest to you to explain the different ways how we can arrive at altruistic behavior, and that this does not require psychological mechanisms necessarily.
So one of the things that I think is really important to do is to separate altruistic behavior from a kind of altruistic psychology, and that there might be multiple kinds of psychologies that would get us to altruistic behavior. So a point that I was thinking about making earlier today, but I was persuaded to leave it out, is to think that to realize that there's lots of altruistic behavior in the world, in creatures that have no theory of mind, have no way of, who are unlikely to be solving the problem the same way that we are, or the same way that a chimpanzee is. So slime molds perform self-sacrificial altruism. I mean, these are one-cell organisms. I mean, there's just no way they have a theory of mind, right? I mean, they have no mind, so that's it. And so the psychologies underlying altruistic behavior are complicated. I think knowing what others want and desire, knowing what's going on in somebody's mind, gives you a lot more information about what you might be able to do to help them. But it doesn't necessarily provide you with the motivation to help.
exactly.
So I could know all about you, know exactly what you want. You really, really want that banana, but I don't like you, and I'm not going to do it. So I think you need something, at the minimum, you need some kind of motivational inclination, and then theory of mind might help, but I don't think it's necessary, and I don't think it's sufficient.
Mm-hmm. Excellent point. We could go straight to. Would you like to add?
Felix
or?
probably has a comment on that.
Yeah, maybe let's speculate about the evolution of this a little bit. So, what are circumstances under which these capacities emerge? And I mean, one possibility is that we talk here about a behavior that's quite sophisticated because it brings together this motivational part and quite sophisticated cognitive capacities. But that doesn't mean that they have co-evolved, right? It's a plausible story to assume, and several people have made that for the intention reading part, the theory of mind is more of a Machiavellian one, where this is something that is very important for competition. And then coming from some other route, there are these prosocial motivations, and they merge at some point, maybe already in chimpanzees to some extent, but certainly in humans. So they might have slightly different evolutionary origins, and then one got co-opted and merged into a new system that can engage in these more sophisticated altruistic behaviors.
Very interesting point. Herb, you wanted to comment.
Yeah, there are lots of forms of human altruism that certainly, or at least it seems to me, obviously do not depend on any theory of mind, whatever. Sometimes you get angry at people the same way you get angry at your computer, when it drops your last term paper or something. You just get angry at it. And you get angry at people and you lash out, not because it has nothing to do with them. Road rage is like that. You beep your horn at someone who made some lousy, traffic move. That's an altruistic move, because that's part of the way we discipline each other to drive properly. But we're not doing it because of some theory of mind. But wait, let me just finish that.
I don't think that's right, because intention is a big part of our responses. So if I think that you cut me off on purpose, I'm pissed. But if I for plausibly think you didn't see me, or I have some other explanation, you've got your whole car loaded up with all your possessions, you can't see through your rearview mirror, I'm not mad. I'm, maybe.
No, totally.
So I think that. So that's part of the mind reading, right? That is important in modulating these responses.
But I think it comes at, for instance, sometimes I do something bad on the road and someone will honk and I'll go like this, sorry. And they say, yeah, and everybody's happy. But these are different stages in it. The first stage is probably more like what I'm saying, et cetera. But let me just make one more point here. Some forms of really important human pro-social, and I would say altruistic behavior, don't even have to do with the other guy. Being honest. One is not honest because one cares about the other person. You're honest because you think it's a good way to be. It's a virtue. It's one of my virtues to be honest, trustworthy, courteous. It's not because I care about the other. I may not care about you at all, or I might not even like you. That doesn't mean I'm going to be dishonest or discourteous, etc. There are certain forms of human virtues which are prima facie altruistic, but they're also in a certain way even self-regarding, because they're forms of self-esteem. The way I'm sounding Aristotelian here, but I think there is a very strong element of that in human behavior, that it's just there's certain things that are the right thing to do. You don't have to have a theory of mind for that, except you have to have your own mind.
Kern, you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, I'm a biologist. I'm a behavioral ecologist, and I study social wasps. You might say, well, why do you want to enter into this aspect of the conversation at all? But it's actually an open question how cognitively complex even supposedly small-brain social insects are in assessing features of their social environment, including running simulations of what their co-active partners are planning to do. We don't know that. One of the things that we've been stunned about in studying social insects is that they are much more plastic and adaptively conditional than we ever thought. These are not flying robots. For example, in the honeybee policing story, workers are wonderfully cooperative. They signal the distance and direction to distant food resources to each other, to all in an attempt to maximize the queen's reproductive output. All of the reproductive interests are overlapping and funneled through the queen. But if you remove the queen from the colony, the workers start behaving very differently. They turn on their ovaries. They start fighting each other. They start laying multiple eggs in the cells. They stop foraging. It looks to me like they're assessing the subtle feature of the social environment has changed that completely changes the cost-benefit picture to them for selfishness. So that's a gross example. There are finer examples. If you make subtle changes in the composition, the relatedness, the kinship composition of my social wasp colonies, you very carefully can modulate the degree of aggression within the group, and also the intensity of the dominance hierarchy, the clarity of the dominance hierarchy. So these critters seem to be assessing a whole lot more about their social environment than we ever thought before. And so don't be surprised if something like a theory of mind, which in my view would be running simulations of the other partner's future behavior, may not just be the sole province of human beings. That's the main point I want to place on the table for consideration.
That's an interesting
But
bet.
can they pass the false belief test?
Right. Yes, right. Will they pass? Right, exactly. I think this is really interesting. Just let me add one little thing. The word hasn't been used yet. Empathy. There is, of course. You might argue, why is there empathy? Because probably it makes us better at cooperating, reading the needs of others, and so on. And it's sort of along the lines of Felix's speculation. if it's really making cooperation much more effective, maybe the positive side of empathy, or of theory of mind, evolved for this very reason. Once we became more prosocial, we actually needed smoother psychological mechanisms, and empathy does that job for us, but it relies very strongly on theory of mind. And so it could well be that, you know, the difference between the chimp aspects of theory of mind and human ones have a lot to do with our cooperative attitudes and our cooperative tendencies. Of course, not taking away the fact that you can probably get a lot of effects of the theory of mind done without having it, right? But sort of running simulations would sort of, or having
lower levels of cognitive complexity approximate
having little rules
the same
that
thing.
are exactly that are equivalent to running simulations that which are equivalent to having a theory of mind.
Right.
You can't tell the difference from the outside,
Correct.
of course. So, anyways, very interesting issue.
We'll see.
I see that somebody wants to ask another
I just
question.
wanted to say that if slime molds have a theory of mind, it's wrong. I actually did want to ask a question, though.
Oh, I see. Yes, but that wasn't a question.
no,
you
that
see.
wasn't.
No.
That was a statement.
A statement
it was
about
a statement.
slime
I'm
mold
sorry.
theory of mind. Yes.
Going out on a limb there, I must say.
I don't think they have minds, but perhaps I'm selling them short.
Please.
But they're very short.
The Republican.
One of the things that Herb is really the only person who's talked about this is what precipitated these peculiar shifts towards various kinds of eusocial propensities in the human lineage that were not there in the other primates with whom we seem to share ancestrally some of these capacities for inclinations toward other regarding or altruistic or cooperative behavior. Herb suggested two factors, which are not unique to his model of things. One was large game hunting, and the other was a prolonged life history pattern, which I guess we could read as cooperative breeding.
Well, a long dependence on provisioning by others.
Yeah,
Right,
a long
right.
dependence on provisioning by others. But there are certainly a lot of people, known to many of us in this room, who have other ideas about the thing that kicked us over into this weird, unique kind of prosocial adaptation. And as you know, people who study human evolution and look at the fossil record and the archaeological record are interested in trying to figure out where the kick came and what caused it and when it phased in. I was wondering if anybody on the panel would like to talk about this, or is there something empirical that we can in fact say about this?
Excellent question. I think the crux will be to in the last little bit there, can we ever empirically test these ideas? But there's plenty of speculation. So anybody wants to volunteer? Well, you know my position probably, and that is I think that, as you say, there's two big external drivers have been identified. There could be many more. One is between group competition, and we've seen that in the social insects as well. But the other one is, as with the social insect, is to have the common resource that is then shared by others, sort of the collective element, which is representing, as Herb was emphasizing, the sort of the large game would do that job for us because we produce it, we share it, and so that's a collective action that we need to do. And then in order to maintain those activities, we need to change our psychology and become really prosocial. I think the challenge is to say, okay, what would we see in the fossil record or the archaeological record that would tip us off that these things are happening? We know that, depending on who you talk to, either at 1.8 million years ago or at 2.5 million years ago, we were hunting large game, which does require cooperation at that stage, certainly if not in acquisition, then certainly in defense against large carnivores and in the actual sharing, because no matter how hungry I am, I'm not going to eat a large bovid in a day, right? So that does imply sharing. So we see a lot of elements there, plus the fact that if this was a routine activity, the juveniles were certainly not able to do this, so they needed to be provisioned by others. There needed to be massive tolerance around those kills, as we see in wild dogs and so on at the moment. So those elements could have easily driven us into that direction, or we're perhaps even already sort of, how these things co-evolve, an expression of something else that put us in that direction. But it certainly requires these kinds of elements, which I would think are really indicative of cooperative breeding, because that's the easiest way to get into this. You get chicken egg problems there, but anyway. The between group competition is likely to have come in, as Herb was also emphasizing, much later. Because initially it looked very much like what chimps are doing, and chimps weren't pushed over that edge. And so our suggestion is that, that also, if you look at the archaeological record, the evidence for warfare, the massive evidence, comes with sedentism. Before that, we don't see. Now, that could be a pure artifact of the record, of course. And so, again, the challenge is to turn these ideas into testable predictions that you can actually go out and test in the archaeological record. And I think that I've used up a lot of time so that the others could think about this.
Yes, thank you. That was very considerate. So I think I think that the ecological argument about hunting and big game are just relying on meat. I don't know how big they have to be, but hunting and sharing and division of labor, all those things seem really important. But it seems to me those things might get you to be like another cooperative breeder, which is very cooperative, and but not necessarily as altruistic as we see in modern humans.
We're on the superorganism scale, we're not far enough to the right.
Not that far.
Lions, for example.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, so we're still seeing most of the benefits going toward relatives. We're still seeing that it's pretty much within a fairly circumscribed group where you can see the reproductive benefits from sharing. To get to that next stage, maybe we need some other evolutionary selective pressure.
Yeah, possible.
But I think that the getting us so that we're at least provisioning one another and in a kind of economic interdependence is a really crucial step, which we don't see really in chimps or in other primates, except cooperative breeders.
These are called co-evolutionary processes, which makes it so hard to find the prime movers, of course. I don't know who wants to go first. Herb?
Instead of answering exactly that question, I'd like to say that there are two things very special about humans, I think, that one could not have, they are emergent properties of a complex, dynamic, adaptive system of a species as it evolves over time, absolutely shocking, without precedent. The first is that humans play games. Homo ludens. You can teach a child to play a game, and children will play games together. We can use games to study experimentally how people behave. As far as I know, animals play games, but they're built-in games. There's one game they play or two games they play. You can't teach them a new game, and they can't play games with each other. The other side of that, and that's what human society is, it's a game where we change the rules all the time. And the other side of it is that human beings internalize norms. That is, we're like programmable computers, where the goals that we seek are themselves socially determined. This, as far as we know, is quite unique. And if I had to say what these are due to, I would say that, humans evolved in a period of very volatile weather where we had to adapt very rapidly to temperature changes over a period of 100,000 years, followed by 50,000 years of very nice weather in which we could reap the benefits of all the cognitive and social gains that we got from having to deal with the bad periods. And that's the 50,000 years where human concentrations rose. Therefore, you could have culture. So you have all sorts of new cultural forms, which I think are a function of the population density. And everything else is real easy. But how it came to be that this one species acquired the ability to play games and to internalize norms is really, to me, a total miracle.
I'm left in a stunned silence here. So go ahead.
So one of the factors that everybody shined a light on is intergroup competition. And I should say that in my realm, studying social insects, there's now increasing belief that that may be the key to explaining how you get superorganisms. The most extreme levels of reproductive altruism that are seen in the animal kingdom are in the social insects, where you have some workers in some species, for example, of ants, that have lost their ovaries entirely. There's no reproductive option at all. In honeybees, you do have workers that can at least produce male eggs. And I talked about policing yesterday. That seems to be part of the story, but increasingly it looks like intergroup competition may be a theme that's important to understanding the extreme levels of cooperation and up to worker sterility, so the emergence of superorganisms, even in the invertebrate realm. One of the questions I had for the other panel members is, what's the evidence that intergroup competition might have been important in the human lineage before the advent of agriculture and clustering of large groups? Is there any evidence, or is it just not there? What would we look for?
Well, my answer would be that the best model we have for that, deficient as it is nomadic hunter-gatherers. And right. Again, with it depends a bit on who you talk to and how you interpret this. But the way I've read that literature suggests to me that the nature of between group competition and hunter-gatherers is in the form of raids. So it's sort of like chimpanzee situations where you have overwhelming force. You go in, the Powell doctrine, you might say. You do your killing quickly. You have overwhelming force, low risk, and then you go back as quickly as possible. That's not entirely what's going on, but that seems to be a fair description. In other words, systematic warfare, and where you say that group is bad overall instead of so-and-so has done something bad in that group, we have to take revenge on this person. That's, according to a lot of people, is more recent. But again, we have the problem of, I could make these statements, other people can make other statements. This is the model. We know the model isn't perfect, and so there may be aspects to that model that do not reflect the ancient situation. And then, so the challenge, as I said earlier, is to really find ways of empirically testing these ideas in periods that are way, way behind us. So it's going to be really difficult.
Just want to add one quick thing to that. One of the nice things, and this is my pitch for social insects, about working with social insects, is you can test these ideas experimentally. Mm-hmm. One of the things we've done is manipulate nearest neighbor distances in the field, increasing the level of intergroup competition, and you can actually boost levels of within-group cooperation facultatively by doing so.
Those experiments we can do in modern humans.
Yes.
It's not going to help us understand the history.
Early.
We would like to see a nice radiation of hominids that are running around in different places that we can do these comparisons with.
That comparative data.
I would like just to have Neanderthals around.
Well, but go back 30, 40,000 years. We would have had Neanderthals, Flores people, whatever was running around in China maybe, and so on. There were all kinds, well, maybe you have to go back a bit earlier, but not so long ago, there were lots and lots of organisms in our own lineage. We could have, hominids. Yeah, I was also thinking Madagascar, for instance. If you go back 2,000 years, you would have had a completely different view of primate sociality, perhaps, than we have now, because there's this whole part missing of the picture, and we just pretend it's not there because the drunk on the lamppost looking for his keys. The next question.
So maybe a follow-up for Professor Reeves about the testability or not of maybe the interaction between what you called ecological factors and the intergroup competition, the former of which seems to be more purely altruistic in character, perhaps, even though it's brought about by an external stimuli. It could be a matter of survival. And the other is, you may call that a natural stimuli, whereas the other is an artificial, but they both may be examples of what's called elsewhere non-zero sumness. So no matter where the motive for this cooperation, they both come about. I'm interested in how they may interact.
In the social insects?
And maybe some extrapolations or hypotheses about beyond social insects.
To human. So let me make sure I understand your question. Is the question, how do we know that the kinds of manipulations that we carry out mimic actual natural situations? Is that what you're getting at?
That would be interesting too, but
okay, I misunderstood. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if how those two interact, the ecological stimuli that I was calling natural, and these forms of selection that are I was calling artificial, that are in the form of intergroup competition and may, strictly speaking, be more selfish, but have a altruistic or a beneficial result for the group as a whole. Do you see what I mean?
Well, I think that intergroup competition probably could qualify as just as natural as forms part of the ecological factors that you're talking about. And if you look in insect societies, not just locally, but on a broader scale, they tend to occupy very patchy environments. And so there's natural competition for scarce amount of resources. And that probably has been a potent selective force very, very long in their artificial history. So I would say that that's been a generator of natural selective forces. It is not artificial in any way. It's not human imposed, although probably human development has affected the intensity of it in some places.
Sure. So maybe let me sharpen that.
Right.
Artificial perhaps is the wrong word, but it seemed as if by some mechanism, there was the illusion of an ecological stimuli, like a pressure to not be selfish anymore. But it was coming without that external stimuli. In other words, I thought that's what intergroup was meant to communicate, that there's some way in which...
Well, they have to, yeah, so what the social insects have to have for this whole model to work of intergroup competition driving within group cooperation is they have to have some way of assessing the degree of intergroup competition. What are those stimuli? How exactly are they doing it? They don't necessarily always just fight with each other. So it looks like they have multiple ways of doing it. For example, just looking at encounter rates with members of other colonies, that we know that social insects are very, very good at recognizing members of their own colony and distinguishing them from members of other colonies, usually through chemical signatures on their cuticles, the insect skin. So there are lots of ways that they can, from the relative encounter rates, assess what the local density of rival groups is and modulate their degree of cooperation based on those assessments. Again, the social insects turn out to be much more plastic than we thought. So one prediction is, for a given species, when you have an area where the colonies are typically been aggregated for long periods of time, we expect either a naturally selected response or a facultative response reflecting a rule that's been naturally selected, where these colonies would perhaps exhibit more cooperation within the group than in other areas where they're more rarefied, where they're sparser in their distribution. There could be genetic differences between these situations, or there could be simply a facultative rule that's shared between the two situations with an active assessment going on. And that it looks like there's more and more evidence that that's the case.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We have another question, I see. Go right ahead. Just speak into it.
To actually follow up on what you were saying, I was wondering if altruistic behavior was observed, I mentioned earlier slime mold, was observed in simpler life form, and whether there is, on a molecular level, whether there's DNA or certain chemical reactions that promoted this behavior, and whether that could be...
Yeah, there's a lot of interest right now in kin-selected altruism operating in very simple organisms, even unicellular organisms. I'll give you one example that I've been working on from plants. If you look at a tug of war between plants over the soil nutrients, you can modulate the intensity of this tug of war by having either related or unrelated plants competing for a scarce resource, like a limiting nitrogen nutrient in the soil. Plants don't have nervous systems, but they appear to have the ability to assess, at least in soybeans and some other species, assess the relatedness to their partners, their competitors, really in this case. So this is a pure tug of war, and modulate their root-to-shoot ratios based on that assessment. And as far as looking at kin selection among smaller units, just think of your own body. What are you composed of? You're composed of millions and millions of cells that are almost genetically identical to each other, right? Well, that gives us a clue as to the formation, the origins of multicellularity. Almost certainly was kin-selected altruism, where all these cells got together, but only a few of these cells, the gamete-producing cells, are the ones that get to reproduce. Your somatic cells are essentially the sterile workers in the social insect colony. And that means at some early stage, when there was the early stages of multicellularity with reproductive divisional labor emerging among the cells, constituent cells, you must have had very kin-selected altruism occurring among things that didn't have nervous systems. So that makes the point that was made earlier, that you can have altruism without any fancy cognitive machinery underlying it.
Right. Excellent point. I see a question in the back.
I'm hoping the panel can talk a little bit about the role that language has played in all of this. It seems that being altruistic requires knowing what others want, and if they can just tell you, then that kind of forms a bridge. But in hearing about social insects, I'm wondering about communication in them as well, and whether that plays a role. And then, of course, I'm thinking about developmentally, whether children are picking up these altruistic skills at the same time they're developing language skills, and if those are related at all to forming this understanding of what is going on in other people's minds.
That opens up a whole array of issues. Very good. We can have, well, I would say my colleagues who study humans should start first, I would say.
Right.
Herb or Felix, would you like to have a stab?
I can try, yeah. Well, I think I've seen that these young children do it before language, and chimps do it to some extent as well, certainly without ever acquiring language. So I don't think it's necessary for these basic forms of helping in this case. But it certainly plays a major role to facilitate this, and there are many ways in which this can occur. I mean, one is that you learn about other people's needs, like you said, through language, so it's not necessary to do it in the co-presence of others. So, for example, when we talk about empathy, this is one of the claims by Martin Hoffman, who has the most elaborate theory about the development of empathy, that we start out with these concrete situations where we feel with another person's pain. And this is the origins. That's the primordial form in ontogeny. And that gets translated into more complex forms of sympathy, where we feel with other people who we don't even know, but we hear about them through communication, and this has to be language. Then we also feel with them and act prosocially towards them. So this is, I think, one role that it plays, that language could play, where it expands the circle of potential recipients. And another way is gossip, that it's really hard to communicate to you about someone else that is not present, that this person is mean or nice, without language. I just cannot imagine how that would occur. So I think for this, language is very important. And another one, and that's maybe somewhat related, is socialization of norms. Once they are expressed linguistically, it's much easier to transmit these norms, rather than showing how to be nice or how to mean, just punishing someone who doesn't understand what did I do wrong, but you have to explain it to them. So here we go again back to Martin Hoffman, who says the best strategy in educating children to be empathic or actively empathic is to explain to them what they did wrong, why it was not a good thing what they did. And this is based upon the idea that they have this empathic feeling, and then you explain to them what the consequences were of the child's behavior on this other person. And through this, what he calls inductive parenting, they will understand that maybe it was not, they shouldn't repeat that because it led to the negative consequence of this person, and because they have this natural inclination to care about others, they will be less likely to do it again. But for this to happen, language seems to play a major role.
Very interesting. Herb.
Yeah, I have, 3 points. First, it's easy to think language is, well, we have a big brain, lots of synapses, and language is just a result of cognitive development. But the most interesting thing is the physiology of language. The development of the larynx and the throat and the tongue and the facial muscles, all of which are extremely different in humans than in other primates. Apes don't talk, not because they're stupid, but because they don't have the vocal apparatus to talk. They can only make very high vowel sounds. This evolved through an adaptive process over 150,000 years and more, and we know this because we can see the physiology of it on in the skeletal structures. So language is absolutely central. It's I think, obviously separate adaptation. Now, the second thing is, why? Well, first, the most important thing I think about language is it's not useful unless it's truthful. Felix mentioned this. Why would language be truthful? Why would people ever tell the truth? Well, you have to have punishment and you have to have social norms before you can have language that's going to be, in general, truthful transmissions. Once you have that, in other words, it's a social issue of punishment and the cooperation, then language becomes really powerful because it can organize people in large groups. Third, now there is some contention about this, but I will still maintain it's fairly plausible that humans evolved in small, relatively egalitarian groups in which the leaders could only lead by persuasion, not by coercion. They had to be able to tell other people about what the right thing to do was, because without an amassed wealth, money, agriculture, trade, etc., the only way you could get people to do what you want to do is to persuade them. So naturally, you would get the best persuaders would be the ones that had the best language and could also have the best theory of mind to figure out what you say if you want people to believe you. So again, these all fit together with the notion of cooperation. Language allows you to cooperate, and there are huge adaptive benefits physiologically and neurologically to language development.
Would you like to add something to this? Yeah.
I would
Joan?
just say that although we can see how these things work together, it's still really hard to reconstruct the evolutionary beginnings. And, that's still a big puzzle.
Although the concept, there's clearly a link to cooperation.
There are three ways I want to mention in which communication, obviously there are no grammar-based languages in the social insects, but there are very sophisticated communication systems, promote cooperation. The first one is a case that most of you have undoubtedly heard of, and it regards the honeybees that I talked about yesterday. Have you heard about the waggle dance in the honeybees, where workers advertise the distance and direction to the food resource, to the characteristics of the waggle, its duration, and its angle with respect to vertical? Obviously, that's mobilizing lots of cooperation and coordinating high levels of cooperation. Probably makes the colony more efficient at competing against rival colonies, right? But there's strong selection to mobilize as many foragers and get them to the good foraging sites, patches of flowers, as quickly as possible. So that's the one that everybody knows about. There are also cases in a conflictual context or selfish context that still promote cooperation. In my paper wasps, if you watch a colony, these are the paper wasps that nest on the eaves of buildings around here. You can see into the cells, you can see the larvae, you can see the adults walking around on the nest. If you watch them for just a few minutes, you don't have to wait long before you see one wasp darting and lunging and sometimes biting at another wasp that's hanging around the edge of the comb. Now, why is that important? Well, around the edge of the comb are where the new eggs are being laid. That's the scene for most of the reproductive competition. And the function of these darts from our experiments appears to be a threat that you better not eat my egg and replace it with your own. And what happens in response to these darts is that the wasp that's darted at stops hanging around and either flies off the nest and goes to forage or starts taking care of the older brood in the center of the comb. So it's a policing mechanism that promotes cooperation. And the third example is one that's generating a lot of excitement, and it results from it's case of cooperation resulting from a failure of communication. So there are lots of social insect colonies in which the queen has mated multiple times, which means you have mixtures of full sisters and half sisters in the colony, or there are multiple queens. So you have a mixture of kin in the colony. But over and over again, we're finding that there's no evidence for within colony nepotism. Full sisters don't appear to favor full sisters over half sisters, et cetera, as simple-minded kin selection thinking would lead you to believe. So why? That's a puzzle. Is that a violation of kin selection theory? One consequence of it, it means that they're not worrying about making sure the resources go to their patrilineal, for example, so it reduces the level of competition. But why is it? And the current thinking is that there's selection on the brood to hide their kinship information. You don't want to reveal that you are this one's full sister if 90% of the members of the colony are your half sisters and are going to be more likely to not give you food or remove you and drop you from the nest entirely. So this appears to be selection for reduced communication about information that otherwise would lead to conflict within the colony due to differential nepotism.
Brilliant. Would you like to respond to this, or are you happy now that it turns out that there are plenty of interactions?
Sounds great. Actually, a follow-up question. I was thinking of a lot of the students in the room here posted really wonderful questions to you guys on Facebook. And I'm wondering, most of the communication that was done throughout human evolutionary history was face-to-face. And we're entering a period now where a lot of the communication we do is through social networking and texting, and there's not as much face-to-face interaction. And I'm wondering if, I don't know what you guys think about any consequences in terms of cooperation, altruistic acts, and whether the networking that goes on around the world could be beneficial in terms of cooperation and altruism, of knowing what's going on the other side of the world, or if there could be consequences for not having these face-to-face interactions.
I guess lots of people have thought about this. I see Joan jumping up, Felix jumping up. So who wants to take the first stab? Well, let me have a first stab so they can think about it again. It's my role here. I think what might happen is what have we seen in human evolution, or the human history rather than prehistory, sort of a continuous redefinition of the in-group, right? As we developed states, we decided that these funny-talking people from other tribes who finally sort of learned to speak our language are also in-group now instead of stinking foreigners, right? And so gradually we started to become more inclusive. And I think with these new social media, our ability to expand the in-group to people that aren't physically there is going to increase. And another really important factor is truth and real information is going to make it harder for governments to be despotic. So I think in general, these media will have the impact that we are going to be more cooperative overall. But I'm sure now the others have thought about their objections to this idea or other angles. Felix?
Well, maybe I think there are examples where something just gets transferred into that world of the World Wide Web. So eBay, for example. I mean, this is very interesting because it seems to all be based upon reputation, right? So the way you ensure that people actually cooperate is through reputation, and this is facilitated because you keep the record, right? I don't know how many years this goes back, but you can see that this one gave you what you wanted only 95% of the time, and then you go to someone else. So I think this is something that can amplify something that already existed in face-to-face interaction.
Good point. Herb.
I'm almost saying I'm voting for Carl. I mean, I totally agree with that. The role of increased communication in making a world where people are tolerant of each other, I think has been amazing. It's very hard for people to really lie about another group because it's easy to find out how they are. Does this group really eat, Christian babies? Do they really have horns? I mean, these are things that 30 years ago people could reasonably believe that you can no longer believe. And the world response to calamities is it's just unbelievably more. We're so much closer than ever before. So I think face-to-face is very, very important. Don't get me wrong, but there are cyber relationships which are very strong between people who don't even know what the other people look like, and there's an outpouring of help people give each other, in groups where no one even will ever see the other person. So I don't think we're losing from face-to-face.
Well, we're enhancing.
Plus, my computer has a little thingy there where I have to brush my teeth before I even do my email now, see?
You have to click it.
They can see me wherever I'm...
Excellent. Okay, well, that was a very interesting expansion. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about empathy. It wasn't about Facebook, but now it's about Facebook. Did any of you read the New Yorker piece? It was a few weeks ago. It started off talking about the civil rights movement and how those college kids sitting on the little seats in the coffee shop where they weren't allowed to be.
Greensboro?
These were college roommates who knew each other really intimately, and they only went in because their friends went in, their closest friends went in with them, basically arguing that the only way you get that kind of altruism is with really thick personal ties. What you get on Facebook is, I'll give you 10 cents. And you can get 10 million people to give you 10 cents, but you're never going to get that kind of change that requires you to lay it all out on the line. So there's the thinness of Facebook, but let me try to turn that into the question I wanted to ask initially, which was about the relationship between altruism and group competition. I can see how for the social insects those things evolve together because you're being altruistic towards your hive mates and you're competing against other hive mates. As humans have this, let me call it empathetic altruism or something, that kind where you can be altruistic toward an utter stranger, someone you don't know, and yet you can feel at one with that person in some sense. Or we can also totally demonize that person and kill them with no feelings of regret. We do both of those things. So that it's less clear to me for humans how that pair evolves together. We talked about the evolution of these forms of altruism, but why would that go together with this other anti-altruistic feeling? What's the evolutionary pressure? And maybe there is a social insect question there, although I know the answer. Is there ever altruism toward another hive?
Perfect question. We sort of touched upon it earlier a couple of times, but it clearly is a big issue. Joan seems to be willing to entertain it first.
Well, I think that this is one of the really interesting things about people, that on the one hand, we're capable of this, extreme empathy, and we can also capable of equally extreme forms of savage, violent behavior toward our enemies. I think one thing that's interesting and from the ethnographic literature is that, people have these very strong in-group ideas, and the rules that make us nice and everything apply pretty strictly to in-groups. And it's associated often with how people refer to people from other groups. So we are human, and they are not. Right. And I think that it sets the boundaries for compassion. I think what we're seeing in the modern world, which I think is a fairly, a sort of maybe not historically really deep pattern, is a willingness to extend the boundaries of our in-group, which is what Felix mentioned. So we, and it may be uniquely in human history, are extending the boundaries of our in-group so that we're willing to extend to very distantly connected people the same kinds of moral standing that we assign to our in-group members.
Excellent point. Matt?
I'd just like to, for the sake of argument, propose the contrary position, which is that the new media of communication, in fact, make it possible for you to narrow your in-group to a precise focus that has never been possible before in human history. I can have a social life that consists entirely of tweeting and texting and exchanging email messages with nothing but left-handed 45-year-old Canadian Presbyterian shoe fetishists. And or
With green sweaters.
with green sweaters. And there are things like this, and these are, also have political reality. I mean, a lot of the so-called terrorist activity that goes on at the moment is made possible by and furthered by and given force and impetus by the ability of the internet to let people with tiny minority viewpoints and interests and tastes form in groups that could not have existed before in human history.
That may be true
guess
as
both-
well.
Both things ring true. I may want to add one or two things. Or Kurt.
Oh, I just want to
Go
say,
ahead.
yeah, I was thinking about your question, made me think. And there are cases where sometimes members of the out group, there are conditions under which they will be accepted into the group, ecological situations. For example, if there's a food dearth or both colonies become reduced in population to nearby colonies because of bird predation, let's say, or some sort of vertebrate predation, and they have some degree of relatedness to each other, even though this group has higher relatedness within than it does to the members of this group over here, the groups will often merge. So there are conditions where they actually seem to perform a cost-benefit analysis that, hey, we're better hanging together, even though we're going to have a diluted relatedness than being apart. So there are some examples where that might happen.
Whenever you have something, the social insects will also trump it.
Easy to study.
Internet?
I just have
Not yet.
just a couple of points. First of all, note that we're all here face to face. There's a reason why this is not in cyberspace. People get a lot more. Spending 2.5 days with people, and seeing your faces, this is real important, and it's not going away. And people do try to get together to act together. There's no question about that. Look, here's one, to me, a very interesting point. 50 years ago, when the computer first came out, everybody said, it's going to be the end of public education and the universities. Everything, all learning is going to happen, over the computer. Well, it hasn't even moved an inch towards that. I mean, face-to-face relationship, carnal relations between, professors and students and competition
Please.
among
Careful.
students. Huh? Carnal. Oh, I shouldn't say carnival? Oh, sorry. Face-to-face human interactions are really important to activate whatever it is that's involved in the transmission of information and learning. So, I think these do just both go together.
I guess because those things really use the full spectrum of mechanisms that have evolved to keep cooperation going and keep communication going, whereas all these modern media pick parts of it and are not quite the same thing. But they open up new possibilities that we don't have in.
By the way,
we
Cass
didn't have in the
Sunstein
past.
has a book about just making your point. These groups get together. They read people who have fairly reasonable views about the world. If they get together with others who have those fairly reasonable views, they get extreme views that aren't representative of any one of them, and they just reinforce each other. They say each other back and forth until they really believe it.
That's what I was saying.
Right. Felix.
Yeah, I wanted to add to what Herb said that Anthony Giddens, the British sociologist, has pointed out with regard to globalization that this is does not mean that everything is only happening globally, but there's also localization happening at the same time, that it is still for us very important to engage in this face-to-face interaction. So, for example, with banks, this is one example. You still, in order to show this trust, to forge this trust relationship, you somehow still need this face-to-face interaction, at least to initiate that. So people still really care about these things. They will not just give money to a completely virtual thing. So there is still a point of contact. And it is still also the case that businessmen travel around the world to sign contracts and so forth. So I think this we can extrapolate from this case maybe to also the internet age, which is obviously intermixed with the globalization, that we will probably not give up the face-to-face interaction totally.
I'd like to go back a little bit to the core of the question as a final comment maybe, because I recently heard an anecdote that blew me away. And that's basically, your point is that within group altruism and killing of strangers turn out to be two sides of the same coin. And yet, if those strangers send out strong signals of need we actually have great trouble killing them. And here's an interesting anecdote that I heard, that in some places where you kill people by firing squad, there's always one of the guns unloaded, so that the person, can always claim, well, it wasn't my bullet that killed this poor guy. And so there's a lot of these mechanisms that you can talk a lot about what the mechanism of the concentration camps and so on, where the trick is to sort of take too much empathy out of things, because otherwise people can't do it. And I thought that firing squad story was a beautiful illustration of that. So yes, unfortunately, we have both sides, but even the bad side, the killing side, is we can't really suppress all these signals of need, and we end up still responding to them, but we have to try and eliminate them in war. You don't seem to be terribly convinced by that. But
I have to say, my feeling of the last 2 days, but especially today, is of rose-colored glasses. We had human beings who just at the age of 18 months will help a total stranger, people who will pay large amounts not to be dishonest. And yet, they do that thing with firing squads. I've heard that too. And yet people also tear babies limb from limb.
Of course.
Right? I mean, we all know these cases. And
I think that what's new is to understand better the nice part, which I don't think we had such a strong handle on. I mean, the economists, are dumbfounded, right? So here's a whole very powerful body of thought about human decision-making, which turns out to be incomplete, because it didn't really understand the psychology of the people making decisions. Sure. That's fair to say? And so I guess, no, I mean, nobody is gonna, I don't think that the people who are doing this work are blind to the other side. I mean, war is just the best example of coordinated, cooperative, altruistic activity to very, very, damaging ends. But I think they're closely interlinked.
I read a story about a German general who had to go to Hungary, where I often go, and exterminate the Jews in a certain whole area. And he did a very good job, but he got in trouble because there were irregularities about his finances. And he wrote these long letters about he's upstandingly honest, he wouldn't cheat, he's a totally moral man, he does everything exactly right, So one guy's morality is another guy's death.
Anyway, your point is extremely valid, but now I think we're gradually developing a more rounded view of human nature, where we've always stressed the bad side. We see there's a good side. And if we ever going to apply what we've learned, maybe we can use that to say things, develop better global warming solutions, for instance, etc. But I see there's another question.
I had a question about where religious ideas such as karma fit into human altruism, because for karma, if you help someone on the street that you don't know, totally unrelated, it seems like an unselfish act. But if you're doing it just to boost your personal karma, so something good happens to you, it's totally selfish.
Which is a wonderful question about levels of explanation. It goes into psychological altruism, and maybe the psychologists can talk about this. Or this is you hear it all the time, right? I do this for myself. I'm not doing because I have prosocial tendencies or I have other regarding preferences. So I know Herb probably wants to say something about this. Felix or Joan or... Maybe social insects?
Not on this.
Diffusion.
Okay, look, there are several philosophical religious views in which altruism has to be a sacrifice. Kantianism, deontology. If it's fun, it isn't altruistic. If it's giving you pleasure to help your poor grandma, well, then that's something you like to do. Pure moral acts are always duties. Now, this is a very extreme position, because there are other positions which are exactly the opposite, which is, well, the way we're built is such that when we're nice to people, it makes us feel good. That's the way we're built. And the really hard thing to do is to be nice to people, because, there's all these, we fail, we have weaknesses, we can't achieve our full virtues. And, so in some other religions, they take that point of view. And I must say, I very much agree with the second. That is, it's really hard to be virtuous. It's really hard to be altruistic. But if you are, you're going to be a happy, fulfilled person, a fruitful, living a fruitful life. Now, if that's karma, sounds to me, I don't know, but it sounds to me more like the Kantian version. There's a statement about Kant's fundamentalism in general. A fundamentalist is someone, this is H.L. Mencken, someone who's deeply afraid that somewhere out there there's somebody having a good time.
Yeah, can't have them.
So there is a big literature on empathy, and one of the big issues in this literature is whether or not people perform altruistic acts because of the warm glow effect. That's what it's called, right? You do it because it makes you feel good, or somebody's in distress and that distress is you, so you help them just to relieve your own distress. That's one of the kinds of explanations. And then there is both a sort of discussion of values about if that's okay, what does that make it? Does that make it, does that devalue it? And then the other question is that really how people are built? And so there's both data that suggests that people aren't always responding simply for their own, what's termed hedonistic benefits, but sometimes for other reasons as well. And then, I think different traditions just value the different components of altruism differently. So some value systems focus on the outcome, and some focus on the mechanism. So the mechanism that makes us there's neuroimaging work where people put people in the scanner and then give them a chance to do something philanthropic. Well, the reward centers of your brain light up when you do that, right? And so what does that tell you? Does that tell you that it means nothing, the act means nothing, or does it tell you that people find it inherently rewarding to do good, as Carl said? And I don't think that most religious traditions had neuroimaging in their, in the development of the theology. So then it's a sort of personal and value-laden decision about how to then parse out what's of value and what's not.
Maybe I can add a few things to that, starting from a very simple ecological perspective. If I eat, I feel good after that. It's psychologically rewarding because my hunger is gone. If I compete successfully and I beat somebody in tennis, for instance, I feel good. It's psychologically rewarding. So just like you get a warm glow from throwing a quarter or a dime to a beggar, might get a warm glow from winning. In other words, all the things that are good for our fitness have these psychological reward systems sort of linked to them. I guess why we need social norms and karma or all kinds of systems is that it says, look, these are competing demands. You all feel good after all these things, but we want to make sure that that the balance is going toward the prosocial side rather than what you might call the egoistic or antisocial side, and therefore it has to hurt a little bit once in a while too, because what am I going to do? I'm going to eat this or I'm going to share this. Oh, yes. Oh, it's good for me. Well, okay, now it's tipping that way. And so I can see that it's sort of, that you need this extra accounting system, as it were, to keep us all really honest in the face of all these competing demands on our reward systems. But maybe somebody would like to add to this. No, I see everybody being happy. There's a little bit more time for additional questions. I see somebody would like to ask one more question.
I have a question about individual differences in altruistic tendencies, I guess you would say. It seems like across cooperative species, there are consistent differences in how much individuals are willing to contribute to cooperative goods or just cooperative behaviors. So from what I understand, there's some ant species where there are these elite workers that just work harder than all the other workers. And then Ian Gilby has this study on impact hunters and chimpanzees, and when the impact hunter is present, the group is much more likely to hunt. And of course, in human societies, we see individual differences as well. And I guess what I'm wondering is, are these meaningful differences, or are they just kind of random variation that don't confer any fitness benefits?
I guess it's an obvious one for you, right?
No, I don't. I think it's unlikely that they're meaningless. They probably have an evolutionary import. For example, it's actually a widespread phenomenon. How hard individuals work is highly variable in insect societies. For example, if you remove the queen from the honeybee colony, a few of the workers, not all of them, turn on their ovaries and become more selfish. There are others that don't. So what's going on there? What could account for mixtures of individuals being selfish and others that are being cooperative? Probably there's some form of negative frequency dependent selection going on, right? Where being selfish is advantageous, increases your fitness, your inclusive fitness up to some frequency in the group, but as that increases beyond a certain threshold, then the inclusive fitness of the individual goes down if you're still selfish. So that keeps the proportion below 100%. So it can be anywhere from 0 to 100% depending on the costs and benefits of cooperation. So I think there's a good, and the question is, in humans, we know there's a high heritability and lots of personality traits, and I would assume prosociality is one of them. That's been has a high heritability reported. There are lots of competing explanations for that. One of them is this frequency-dependent selection, and the others are just now that we have a mating melting pot where we have individuals from very different backgrounds, from different populations, mating with each other and contributing to the gene pool, that's going to create lots of variability that is going to come across as high heritability when there were genetic differences originally among the subpopulations. I don't think that's as favored, but the frequency-dependent selection model would be a unifying explanation for both the social insects and potentially for humans. I don't know what the current thinking is about the evolutionary significance of individual differences in humans in prosociality.
I don't know about humans, but I have one really cheery fact, which is that so in long-term studies of baboons, we know that individual variation in the degree of social bonding and the tendency to form strong social bonds has fitness consequences, and it's very similar to the work in humans. And we don't exactly know the mechanisms, but we do know that females that have stronger social bonds have higher fitness have higher survivorship among their offspring, and these girls are living longer too. So to that extent, being the kind of individual who can form strong social bonds, which are the foundation for cooperation, has fitness consequences in humans and in baboons. And so, maybe. I think the answer to your question is maybe.
Well, but I think this is a pretty cheerful note upon which to end. So, altruism sometimes is good for you, and despite all the individual variation, there may be fitness benefits to being an altruist. I'm afraid I have to stop here simply because we're out of time. I know it's always a good sign. There's a lot more questions that we could address. I would like to thank our 4 speakers for their great contributions. I'd like to thank you as an audience for asking all these great questions. I'd like to once more thank Kay Brown for organizing this. And before we close, I'd like to remind you of the fact that there is free food out there. So please enjoy.
Thank you, Carl, for being such a great moderator.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you all.